August 6, 1945. 8:15 a.m. Hiroshima, Japan. Akiko Takahashi was hanging laundry on the line behind her small wooden house, her 8-year-old daughter Yuki playing with a doll in the morning sun, when the world turned white. Not gradually, not with warning, but instantaneously, a light brighter than 1,000 suns, brighter than anything human eyes were meant to witness, a flash that erased shadows and burned them permanently into concrete, a light that arrived before sound, before heat, before understanding. In that fraction of a second, everything Akiko had known disappeared. The clothesline, the house, the neighbor's garden, the street beyond, the entire city of Hiroshima, all of it transformed from the ordinary rhythms of a Monday morning into hell itself. She would later describe that moment to her grandchildren, her voice never quite steady when the memories surfaced, as the instant when time itself seemed to split into two realities, the world before the flash, where she was simply a mother doing laundry, worried about the war but still able to imagine normal life continuing, and the world after, where everything was burning and everyone was dying and the very air itself had become poison. This is her story, and the story of 140,000 souls who experienced the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare, who lived or died in those 9 seconds when physics became apocalypse and a single aircraft delivered devastation that exceeded the capacity of human language to describe. Akiko Takahashi was 32 years old that August morning, a schoolteacher before the war who now spent her days working in a munitions factory and caring for her daughter and elderly mother in their small house in the Otemakai district, approximately 800 meters from what would become Ground Zero. Her husband Hiroshi was somewhere in Manchuria with the Imperial Army, his letters arriving sporadically, each one a small miracle proving he was still alive in a war that was consuming Japanese men by the hundreds of thousands. She hadn't heard from him in 2 months and tried not to think about what that silence might mean. The morning had started like any other wartime morning: wake before dawn, prepare the meager breakfast of rice and pickled vegetables that was all their ration cards allowed, get Yuki ready for school, check on her mother who was growing frilier by the month, then rush to the factory for the 12-hour shift that left her exhausted and mechanical. But that Monday was different. The factory had given workers the morning off to help clear fire breaks in the city, part of the defensive preparations against the American B-29 bombers that had been methodically destroying Japanese cities for months. Hiroshima had been largely spared the firebombing that had devastated Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of other cities. Nobody knew exactly why. Some speculated the Americans were saving Hiroshima for invasion staging, others thought its military installations made it less of a target than industrial centers, still others whispered that perhaps the Americans considered it too beautiful to destroy, with its 7 rivers and green hills and the iconic Itsukushima shrine visible from the city. Whatever the reason, Hiroshima's relative safety had made it a magnet for refugees from bombed cities, swelling its population to nearly 350,000 by August 1945. So when the air raid sirens had sounded at 7:09 a.m. that morning, Akiko had gathered Yuki and her mother and gone to the neighborhood shelter as routine dictated. They'd sat in the dark, damp space for about half an hour, listening to the drone of aircraft engines overhead, waiting for the all-clear signal. When it came at 7:31 a.m., everyone had emerged blinking into the bright summer morning, another false alarm, another disruption to the already disrupted routine of wartime life. Akiko had decided to do laundry while she had the unexpected free time before her afternoon shift. Yuki had begged to stay home from school, sensing her mother's rare availability, and Akiko had agreed, one day wouldn't matter, and she wanted her daughter close. These small decisions, made without knowing their significance, would save both their lives while dooming others who made different choices. Her neighbor Kenji had gone to work at the communications center downtown. The Tanaka family had sent their 3 children to school. Old Mr. Yamamoto was walking to the morning market. All of them were heading toward Ground Zero while Akiko hung laundry in her backyard, 800 meters away, far enough to survive, close enough to witness hell. She'd had the wooden washing tub filled and had been hanging shirts on the line, her hands automatic with the familiar task, her mind wandering to worries about Hiroshi and whether there would be enough food for winter and whether the war would ever end or if they'd all simply starve or be bombed until Japan ceased to exist. Yuki was singing to her doll, one of those nonsense songs children invent, and the morning was hot but pleasant, the sky so blue it hurt to look at directly, not a cloud visible anywhere. Then, at exactly 8:15 a.m. and 17 seconds, the Enola Gay, AB-29 superfortress flying at 31,000 feet, released a single bomb over Hiroshima. The bomb was called Little Boy, a uranium gun-type weapon carrying 64 kilograms of enriched uranium that would achieve critical mass through the simple expedient of firing one piece of uranium into another at the moment of detonation. It fell for 43 seconds, its radar altimeter counting down, its internal mechanisms ticking toward the moment that would change human history. At 580 meters above the ground, directly over the Shima Surgical Clinic in downtown Hiroshima, Little Boy detonated with a yield of approximately 15 kilotons of TNT, 15,000 tons of explosive force released in a fraction of a second, creating temperatures at the hypocenter exceeding 1 million degrees Celsius, hotter than the surface of the sun, temperatures so extreme that matter simply ceased to exist in recognizable form. Akiko never heard the explosion. Sound travels at roughly 343 meters per second at sea level. Light travels at 299,792,458 meters per second. The flash of the detonation reached her in a small fraction of a microsecond. The blast wave and sound would take more than 2 seconds to arrive. In those 2 seconds, she would have the strangest experience of her life, witnessing apocalypse in complete silence. The first thing she remembered, the memory that would haunt her nightmares for the rest of her long life, was the light. She'd been facing away from the city center, toward her house, hanging one of Hiroshi's work shirts on the line. The world turned white, not gradually like sunrise, not naturally like any light she'd ever seen, but instantaneously, a whiteness so intense and complete that it seemed to penetrate through her closed eyelids, through her skull, into her brain itself. She'd instinctively thrown her hands up to protect her face, spinning away from the light source, every animal instinct in her body screaming danger. In that moment of turning, before the blast wave hit, she saw something that defied comprehension. Her wooden house, solid and real a second before, was outlined in brilliant light as if drawn by some cosmic pen, every board and beam suddenly visible through the walls like an X-ray, transparent and glowing. Yuki, her daughter, was frozen mid-turn, her mouth forming the beginning of a scream Akiko couldn't yet hear, her small body illuminated from within as if made of light rather than flesh. Then the heat arrived, a wall of thermal radiation traveling at the speed of light, carrying temperatures that would have instantly vaporized anything at ground zero but was still devastatingly hot 800 meters away. Akiko felt her exposed skin burning, felt the hair on her arms singeing, smelled the terrible odor of her own flesh cooking. Her clothes, she'd been wearing a light cotton dress and apron, burst into flames. The shirt she'd been holding simply vanished, consumed so quickly it left no ash. She'd thrown herself forward, toward Yuki, some maternal instinct overriding the pain and fear and confusion. She'd grabbed her daughter and pulled her down, covering the girl's body with her own, pressing them both flat against the ground just as the blast wave arrived. Later, much later, when physicists interviewed survivors and tried to reconstruct exactly what had happened in those first seconds, they would explain that the detonation created a shockwave traveling outward at supersonic speed, compressing air into a wall of overpressure followed by a partial vacuum, creating winds in excess of 1,000 kilometers per hour near the hypocenter, still hurricane force even at Akiko's distance. But Akiko didn't know anything about overpressure or shock waves or the physics of nuclear detonation. She only knew that something impossible had hit her. It felt like being struck by a giant's fist, like the entire atmosphere had become solid and was trying to crush her into the earth. The sound arrived simultaneously with the blast, a noise so loud it transcended hearing, a physical force that felt like it was tearing her body apart from the inside. Her house, the house where she'd lived for 7 years, where Yuki had been born, where she'd cooked thousands of meals and folded countless loads of laundry and waited for letters from Hiroshi, simply disintegrated. One moment it existed, the next it was splinters and shattered boards flying past her head at lethal velocity. The blast picked them up, Akiko still clutching Yuki, and hurled them backward. They hit something hard, probably the stone wall that bordered her neighbor's property, and Akiko felt ribs crack, felt her head impact stone, felt the world go dark around the edges. But she held on to Yuki, held on with strength she didn't know she possessed, because losing her daughter was unthinkable, worse than death, worse than any physical pain. When the initial blast passed, when the pressure equalized and the worst of the wind subsided, there was a moment of eerie silence broken only by a strange ringing in Akiko's ears. She lifted her head, still covering Yuki with her body, and looked at what had been her neighborhood. That it was gone. Simply gone. The houses, the gardens, the trees that had lined the street, the stone walls and wooden fences, all of it had been swept away as if by an angry god. Where her house had stood was now an empty space filled with smoking debris. Where the Tanaka house had been was nothing. Where old Mr. Yamamoto's shop had operated for 40 years was a pile of burning rubble. And everywhere, there were fires. Not spreading fires like those caused by incendiary bombs, but instant fires, as if everything combustible had been commanded to burn simultaneously. The thermal radiation from the bomb had ignited anything flammable within a 2-kilometer radius. Wooden buildings, paper screens, furniture, clothing on people's bodies, everything was burning. Akiko stood up shakily, pulling Yuki with her, checking her daughter for injuries. The girl seemed stunned but unhurt except for some burns on her arms and face. Akiko's own injuries were more severe, burns over much of her exposed skin, broken ribs, a head wound that was bleeding into her eyes, but she was alive and mobile and her daughter was alive, and that was all that mattered in that moment. Then she heard the screaming. It started as individual voices but quickly merged into a continuous wail of agony that seemed to come from every direction at once. People emerged from the rubble, or tried to emerge, and Akiko saw sights that would scar her soul forever. A woman whose clothes had been burned completely off her body, her skin hanging in sheets, walking in circles calling for her children. A man with a piece of wood speared through his abdomen, trying to pull it out, his hand slipping on his own blood. A child, maybe 5 years old, sitting in the street holding what looked like a piece of her own arm, staring at it without understanding. The ones who could walk were walking, all in the same direction, away from the city center, toward the rivers, toward anywhere that wasn't the flames and destruction. They walked like ghosts, like the living dead, their arms held out in front of them to keep their burned skin from touching anything, their faces blackened and blistered beyond recognition, their eyes vacant with shock. Akiko's mother. The thought hit her like another blast wave. Her mother had been inside the house, in her room in the back where she spent most of her time these days, too weak to do much but sit and watch the world from her window. Akiko frantically began digging through the rubble where the house had stood, throwing aside boards and broken tiles, ignoring the pain in her ribs and the blood running down her face, calling for her mother. She found her 20 minutes later, crushed beneath a fallen beam, dead. Her mother's face was peaceful, eyes closed as if sleeping, and Akiko felt a guilty flash of relief that at least she hadn't suffered, hadn't burned or been trapped and slowly dying. She said a quick prayer, there was no time for proper mourning, no time for anything but survival, and turned back to Yuki. The fire was spreading, consuming the debris, and they needed to move. Akiko picked up her daughter, who seemed to be in shock, not crying or speaking, just clinging to her mother with mechanical tightness. They began walking in the direction everyone else was walking, northeast, toward the rivers and the hills beyond, away from whatever had destroyed their world. The journey to relative safety, a distance of perhaps 3 kilometers that would normally take 40 minutes to walk, took them 7 hours. The streets were impassable with rubble and fire. The bridges they tried to cross were blocked by masses of fleeing people, or destroyed, or covered with bodies of those who died while trying to escape. The rivers themselves were full of corpses, people who jumped in to escape the flames and heat, only to drown or die from their injuries in the water. Akiko saw things during that journey that she would never be able to fully describe, scenes that would visit her dreams for the next 7 decades of her life. She saw horses and dogs and cats all burned and dying, their suffering adding to the general cacophony of agony. She saw soldiers trying to maintain order, organizing rescue efforts, but there were too few of them and too many injured, and eventually even the soldiers' discipline broke and they just stood staring at the destruction with the same shocked incomprehension as everyone else. She saw the mushroom cloud, though she didn't know that's what it was called. It rose into the sky like a living thing, a column of smoke and debris and superheated air that climbed higher than seemed possible, spreading out at the top like some terrible tree, casting the city into an unnatural twilight even though it was midday. The cloud was colors she'd never seen before, purple and orange and black all mixed together, roiling and churning, and small black objects were falling from it. When one landed near her, she saw it was burned paper, pages from books or documents that had been sucked up into the cloud and were now falling like poisoned snow all over the city. They finally reached one of the relief stations that had been set up on the city's outskirts, a commandeered school building that was already overflowing with casualties. Medical personnel were overwhelmed, working with supplies that had been adequate for maybe 100 patients but were now trying to serve thousands. Akiko got Yuki to a doctor who looked her over, treated her burns with whatever ointment was available, and pronounced her likely to survive if infection didn't set in. Akiko's own injuries were deemed serious but not immediately life-threatening, which in triage terms meant she'd have to wait while doctors dealt with people who were actively dying. She sat against a wall, holding Yuki, watching doctors and nurses work themselves to exhaustion, watching people die on the floor for want of treatment or supplies or simply because their injuries were too severe for any treatment to help. It was late afternoon before she learned what had actually happened. A military officer was moving through the relief station, gathering information about the attack, and he mentioned to the medical staff that this had been a new type of bomb, something the Americans called an atomic bomb, a single bomb with the power of thousands of conventional bombs. The official looked haunted as he spoke, as if he could barely believe his own words. Akiko didn't understand the science, didn't comprehend terms like nuclear fission or critical mass or the physics that had allowed the Enola Gay to destroy an entire city with a single weapon. But she understood that something fundamental had changed, that the war had entered a new phase, that humanity had discovered a way to destroy itself more efficiently than ever before. Over the following days and weeks, as the full scale of the disaster became apparent, the numbers emerged. Of Hiroshima's estimated 350,000 population, between 90,000 and 146,000 died in the initial blast and the immediate aftermath, roughly 40% of the city's population killed in seconds or the hours that followed. Another 100,000 were injured, many of them suffering from burns and radiation sickness that would kill them slowly over the coming months and years. The physical city was devastated. Of Hiroshima's 76,000 buildings, roughly 70,000 were damaged or destroyed. 13 square kilometers of the city center were effectively erased, reduced to burning rubble and ash. The few reinforced concrete buildings near Ground Zero remained standing but were completely gutted by fires. Everything else simply ceased to exist. But the numbers, terrible as they were, couldn't capture the human reality. They couldn't describe what it was like to watch your city burn and know there was nothing you could do to stop it. They couldn't express the horror of seeing people you'd known your whole life transformed into unrecognizable burned corpses. They couldn't convey the psychological trauma of surviving when so many others didn't, of carrying that guilt and that memory for the rest of your life. Akiko and Yuki survived the immediate aftermath, but the challenges were just beginning. They had no home, no possessions except the burned clothes they wore, no way to contact Hiroshi assuming he was still alive somewhere in Manchuria, no news of relatives in other parts of Japan. They were refugees in their own city, dependent on relief supplies that were inadequate to the scale of the disaster. And then the radiation sickness began. Neither Akiko nor Yuki understood what was happening when they started feeling ill about 2 weeks after the bombing. They both seemed to be recovering from their burns, the immediate danger appeared to have passed, and then suddenly they were exhausted, nauseous, feverish. Yuki's hair began falling out in clumps. Akiko developed purple spots on her skin that she would later learn were subcutaneous bleeding caused by radiation damage to her bone marrow. Doctors, working with limited understanding of radiation sickness and even more limited supplies, did what they could. Many survivors died during this period, sometimes weeks or months after the bombing, from radiation exposure that had seemed survivable at first but was slowly destroying their bodies from the inside. Akiko and Yuki were among the fortunate ones. Their radiation exposure had been significant but not lethal, and though they would both deal with health problems for the rest of their lives, they survived. 3 days after Hiroshima, on August 9, news reached the survivors that another city had been destroyed in the same way. Nagasaki had been hit with a second atomic bomb, this one even more powerful than the first. The death toll would eventually reach 80,000 in Nagasaki. Japan surrendered 6 days later on August 15, and for survivors like Akiko, the surrender brought mixed emotions. Relief that the war was finally over, that no more cities would be destroyed, that perhaps life could begin to rebuild. But also grief for all that had been lost, and fear about what surrender to the Americans would mean, and anger at the leadership that had brought Japan to such catastrophe. Hiroshi came home in October 1945, one of the fortunate soldiers who survived the war and made it back to Japan. He almost didn't recognize Akiko. She'd lost substantial weight, her hair had grown back but never regained its original thickness, and she carried herself differently, with the careful movements of someone who'd learned that the world could explode without warning. But they were alive, all three of them, and in the aftermath of Hiroshima, simply being alive was a miracle worth cherishing. They rebuilt their lives slowly, over years and decades. There was no returning to the exact location of their old house. Ground Zero and the surrounding area was too damaged, too contaminated, too psychologically devastating. They eventually settled in the outskirts of the rebuilt Hiroshima, in a small house similar to the one they'd lost, and Akiko went back to teaching when schools reopened and needed teachers to help educate a generation of children who'd been traumatized by war. She spoke rarely about August 6 in the early years. The memories were too fresh, too painful, too disturbing to articulate. But as time passed and as the world seemed determined to develop more and more powerful nuclear weapons, as the Cold War superpowers built arsenals capable of destroying human civilization dozens of times over, Akiko began to feel a responsibility to speak, to bear witness, to make sure people understood what nuclear weapons actually did beyond the sanitized language of military strategy and deterrence theory. She became one of the Hibakusha, the survivors of the atomic bombings, who dedicated their later years to peace activism, to speaking at schools and universities, to meeting with politicians and military leaders, to pleading with anyone who would listen to never, ever use nuclear weapons again. She described the flash, the heat, the blast, the fires, the radiation sickness, the deaths of everyone she'd known. She showed photographs of her scars, of Yuki's scars, of the city before and after. She read names of the dead, thousands of names, reminding listeners that each number in the casualty statistics represented an individual human being with hopes and dreams and people who loved them. She met with American officials and told them, without anger but with absolute conviction, that what their country had done to Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a crime against humanity that could never be justified by military necessity or strategic calculations. She acknowledged that Japan had committed terrible atrocities during the war, that Japanese militarism bore responsibility for the conflict, but she insisted that dropping atomic bombs on civilian populations was a moral catastrophe that stained everyone involved. Not everyone wanted to hear this message. Many Americans, particularly veterans who'd fought in the Pacific, believed the atomic bombs were justified because they ended the war and prevented the massive casualties that a land invasion of Japan would have caused. Akiko understood this perspective but rejected it. There are no good choices in war, she would say. But some choices are worse than others. Killing 100,000 civilians in 9 seconds is among the worst choices humanity has ever made. She lived to be 97 years old, dying in 2010, having witnessed Hiroshima rise from the ashes to become a thriving modern city, having seen Japan transform from devastated defeated nation to economic powerhouse, having watched the global nuclear arsenal grow to contain enough weapons to end human civilization many times over. She died without seeing the nuclear abolition she'd worked for, but not without hope that future generations might be wiser than hers had been. Yuki, her daughter, became a doctor specializing in radiation medicine, devoting her career to treating hibakusha and studying the long-term health effects of radiation exposure. She had children of her own, who had children, and Akiko lived to see 3 great-grandchildren who would never know the terror of air raids or the flash of atomic bombs. In her final years, when students would visit to interview her about her experiences, Akiko would always end the conversation the same way. She'd close her eyes, and her voice would drop to barely above a whisper, and she'd describe that moment one more time. The flash was white, brighter than anything you can imagine. It came before sound, before heat, before understanding. For just a moment, the world stopped being the world. And then everything was fire and death and screaming. 100,000 people died in 9 seconds. 9 seconds. Think about that. In the time it takes you to read one paragraph, an entire city died. And the ones who survived, we carried that moment with us forever, every day, every night in our dreams. I'm an old woman now, I've lived a long life, but I still see that flash when I close my eyes. I still feel that heat. I still hear those screams. She'd open her eyes and look directly at whoever was interviewing her, and she'd say with absolute conviction, "Never again." That must be our promise. Never again. Not to Japan, not to America, not to anyone. No human being should ever have to see what I saw, feel what I felt, survive what I survived. The flash that ended 100,000 lives in 9 seconds must be the first and the last. We have the weapons to destroy ourselves now. Whether we choose to do so is up to us. Choose wisely. And then she would dismiss them, tired but satisfied that she'd borne witness one more time, that she'd told the story that needed to be told, that she'd reminded another small group of people that nuclear weapons weren't abstractions or strategic assets but the most terrible invention in human history, and that their use in 1945 was a tragedy that must never be repeated. As the sun set over Hiroshima, over the Peace Memorial Park built where the Shima Surgical Clinic once stood, over the A-bomb dome preserved in its damaged state as a reminder of August 6, over a city that had died and been reborn, the light faded gently, naturally, the way sunsets are meant to fade. Not in a flash. Not in 9 seconds. Not with heat and blast and radiation. Just the slow, peaceful transition from day to night, from light to darkness, the simple rhythm of a world that continued turning, that had survived humanity's worst impulses and might, with wisdom and will, continue to survive them for generations yet to come. The flash had ended 100,000 lives, but it had not ended all life, had not ended hope, had not ended the possibility that humans might learn from their mistakes and choose a different path. That possibility, fragile and uncertain, was Akiko Takahashi's legacy, and the legacy of all the Hibakusha who survived to bear witness, who carried the memory of August 6, 1945, so that the rest of us might never forget what happens when science outruns wisdom, when military power overwhelms morality, when a single flash can end more lives in 9 seconds than most people can count in a lifetime.